Aliens. Over the past century, they've become a pop culture phenomenon, and their existence has been theorized by scientists for hundreds of years before that, and yet credible proof of them is quite hard to come by. I mean, unless of course you're David Icke and you believe in lizards from alternate dimensions, but let's not get into that right now. However, over time there have been a few cases that stand above the rest and, at first glance at least, seem legit. Today, we will look at a few of these cases and see if the aliens are already here. The first of these incidents is the 1952 Washington, D.C. incident, which was a series of unidentified flying object reports from July 12th to July 29th, 1952, above Washington, D.C. The most publicised of these sightings took place on consecutive weekends, July 19th and 20th, and July 26th and 27th. On July 19th at 11:40 p.m, Edward Nugent, an air traffic controller at the Washington National Airport, spotted 7 objects on his radar. The objects were located 15 miles southwest of the city. No known aircraft were in the area, and the objects were not following any established flight paths. Nugent's superior, Harry Barnes, a senior air traffic controller at the airport, watched the objects on Nugent's radar scope. Other objects appeared in all sectors of the radar scope. When they moved over the White House and United States Capitol building, Barnes called Andrews Air Force Base, located 10 miles from the National Airport. Although Andrews reported they had no unusual objects on their radar, an airman soon called the base's control tower to report sightings of a strange object. Airman William Brady, who was in the tower, then saw an object which appeared to be like an orange ball of fire, trailing a tail, unlike anything I had seen before, he said. As Brady tried to alert the other personnel in the tower, the strange object took off at an unbelievable speed. At 3 a.m, shortly before 2 Air Force F-94 Starfire jet fighters arrived over Washington, all of the objects suddenly vanished from the radar at the National Airport. However, when the jets ran low on fuel and left, the objects returned, which convinced Barnes that the UFOs were monitoring radio traffic and behaved accordingly. The objects were last detected by radar at 5:30 a.m. On July the 26th at 8:15 p.m, a pilot and stewardess on a National Airlines flight into Washington observed some lights above their plane. Within minutes, both radar centers at the National Airport and the radar center at the Andrews Air Force Base were tracking more unknown objects. US Air Force Master Sergeant Charles E. Cummings visually observed the objects at Andrews Air Force Base. He later said, "These lights did not have the characteristics of shooting stars. There were no trails. They traveled faster than any shooting star I have ever seen." Meanwhile, Albert M. Chop, the press spokesman for Project Bluebook, arrived at National Airport. He then joined the radar center personnel. By 9:30 p.m, the radar center was detecting unknown objects in every sector again. At times the objects travelled slowly, and at other times they reversed direction and moved across the radar scope at speeds of up to 7,000 miles per hour. On July the 20th, the sightings and unknown radar returns ended at sunrise. Air Force Major General John Samford, who was the US Air Force Director of Intelligence, and Roger Ramey, who was the US Air Force Director of Operations, held a well-attended press conference at the Pentagon on July the 29th, 1952.
2 Air Force officers have over the years been very closely associated with this activity. Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Stacker was formerly the chief spokesman for the Air Force on the matter, and Major Hector Quintanilla is now the chief of Project Bluebook.
The objectives of the program are twofold. They're the same as they have been since 1953 when the regulations were given. First of all, to try to determine if the UFO phenomena presents a threat to the security of the United States. And second, to determine if the UFO phenomena exhibits any technological advances which could be channeled into research and development.
What's the record so far?
To date, we have over 10,000 cases at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, of which 646 of these remain unidentified. That's not to say that we could not have identified more cases if we had gotten to the observer quickly and checked the local activity.
November 23rd, 1953, radar operators in North Michigan pick up a strange aircraft above Visu Locks next to Lake Superior. The aircraft was not on any registers and thus showed up as an unknown. An aircraft was scrambled immediately. Introducing Felix Moncla. He was born in Louisiana in 1926, and during World War II he enlisted in the army and served in occupied Japan. Later on, in 1950, he joined the Air Force. On that day, he was the unfortunate pilot tasked with scouting the object. Alongside radar operator Robert L. Wilson, Moncla took off from Kinross Air Force Base in an F-89C Scorpion. Wilson was struggling to keep track of the object, and the ground radar operators had to give Moncla directions instead. Ground control tracked the Scorpion and the unidentified object as two blips on the radar screen. The two blips on the radar screen grew closer and closer until they seemed to merge. Assuming that Moncla had flown either under or over the target, ground control anticipated that moments later, the Scorpion and the object would again appear as two separate blips. Donald Kehoe reported that there was a fear that the two objects had struck one another, but the singular blip continued on its previous course. Attempts were made to contact Moncla via radio, but without success. A search and rescue operation by both the US Air Force and the Canadian Air Force was quickly mounted, but failed to find a trace of the plane or the pilots. Moncla and Wilson had completely disappeared. In 1968, parts from an aircraft were apparently found on the eastern shore of Lake Superior. News reports were published and rumours went around, but the Canadian government has no record of the parts ever being found. So what conclusions can we come to about these UFO cases? Well, there are many possibilities for what happened in Washington. There is the chance that UFOs are there, but there's also a chance it was just a coincidence. It could have been shooting stars, it could have been experimental planes, maybe the atmosphere just does that sometimes. We'll probably never know. At the time, the people in charge of Project Bluebook seemed a lot more interesting in disproving the alien theories than actually figuring out what caused the UFO. Conclusions about Moncla's disappearance? Well, all sorts of theories have appeared relating to the disappearance, including falling out of the sky due to vertigo, the plane suddenly exploding, to, of course, him being brought on board an alien spaceship. But no matter what happened to him when he was in the sky, it's also important to remember that radars of the time were quite inaccurate. In the 1970s, digital filters were introduced to radar scopes, and the overall number of radar-based UFO cases plummeted. The radar could have been picking up anything from a bird to a boat. So overall, these cases are difficult to figure out, and there seems to be no clear answer. Which is the exact reason that they're called UFOs. They are unidentified flying objects. People always seem to change a UFO discussion into an alien discussion, but it's important to remember that more possibilities, quite a lot more possibilities, do exist. Weather phenomena, meteorites, anything of that sort could have happened in these cases. And the truth is, we probably will never know, unless someone comes forward with some magical new evidence, which is very, very unlikely nowadays, especially since these took place in the early 50s. We're just probably not going to get any closer to figuring them out.